What we actually have in Iran are arbitrary executions. These are killings, they are murders.
Welcome to Eye for Iran. I'm Negar Moshehedi. In Iran, industrial cranes are increasingly becoming symbols, not of construction, but of public executions. As the world's attention remains fixed on the war, the executions of protesters who rose up during January are accelerating. We begin with Professor Payam Akhavan, one of the world's leading experts in international law, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
There's no doubt that we have a crime against humanity, that specifically the case can be made that this is a crime of extermination, given the large scale of the killings.
Then, President Trump says he'll finish the job if Iran refuses a deal. But what exactly does he mean? We put that question to Admiral Robert Harward, former Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command, and Blaise Misztal, Vice President for Policy at GINSA.
That they attacked our people and killed our people. I think he came to the realization negotiations aren't going to happen. We've just got to get capitulation.
Then at least we can deny it the revenue, the sources of commerce with which to both enrich itself and fuel and fund its nuclear program, its campaign of terror, both against the Iranian people and the region.
And finally, after Ukraine's unprecedented strike on an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, we asked whether the wars in Ukraine and the Iran war are beginning to overlap in ways we haven't seen before. Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute and Nicole Grajewski of Sciences Po join us to explain what it means for Iran, Russia, and the wider region.
They're really trying to show how involved the Russians have been in Iranian targeting or in Iranian military action.
That was basically the message of many inside Iran at the time. Like, what are we doing? We don't need to help the Russians.
Let's get into it. I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Professor Payam Akhavan is a former UN prosecutor and human rights chair at the Massey College at the University of Toronto. He is one of the world's leading experts in international law and international criminal justice and served as the first legal advisor to the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, helping lay the legal foundations for prosecuting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It's truly a privilege to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Negar.
Professor Akhavan, there is a post going viral online that reads, the most tragic thing about being Iranian is when the government erects industrial cranes, and it's not for infrastructure projects, it's not to embetter the lives of Iranians, but rather because their own government is about to publicly hang its own citizens. Given the war and public opinion about Iran, why were the executions carried out so publicly?
Thank you, Negar. It is really a very tragic moment for the Iranian people who are ushered in this year with the mass killing of protesters in the streets of Tehran, cities throughout the street, which were unprecedented in scale. And then the circumstances of the war have now led to the Islamic Republic escalating what was already an alarmingly high level of executions. According to Amnesty International, there were more than 2,100 executions last year. And in recent times, there has been an escalation in those executions, apparently to create a climate of fear, to project an image of strength and control on the part of the regime. But it had been some time since cranes were used for public hangings. And that's why the events of 2 days ago, July 28th in Esfahan, have been particularly shocking. But what is remarkable is that there were protests against that hanging, and some of the protesters were once again killed. There are an estimated 1,500 people on death row in Iran. And of course, many of them are sentenced to death based on vague national security charges for this absurd idea of being a muharib or waging war against God, whatever that means. So it's not just that the death penalty itself is barbaric, let alone public execution, which reminds one of medieval Europe when there were public executions on the streets of London and Paris. But it's also that the charges against those who are being executed are absurd. International human rights law provides that where states have not abolished the death penalty, it must be limited only for the most serious crimes, such as murder. And in addition, those who are being hanged in the streets of Esfahan and elsewhere are not being given a minimal fair trial guarantees. Many of the cases involve forced confessions under torture as the so-called evidence based on which individuals admit to crimes they probably never committed. There is no right to a defense counsel. The courts can hardly be called impartial. So when you put all of that together, it is really a tragic moment for the people of Iran.
Some people have asked me, given the context of the war, wouldn't this government want to create some sort of unity versus these public hangings, like you mentioned, with cranes?
Well, it's a good question. And in fact, because of the war, there has been a surge of, if you like, national pride and unity against the foreign adversaries, which of course the Islamic Republic has used to its advantage at a time when there is so much popular discontent against the regime. But I think the instinct of the Islamic Republic is generally violence. It is not about building unity. And we know from historical precedents, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war in 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a notorious fatwa in which some 5,000 leftist political prisoners were executed in secret and then dumped in mass graves. And throughout the Iran-Iraq war, under the cover of fighting a common enemy, the Islamic Republic consolidated its grip on power by eliminating its enemy. And this is exactly what they're doing again today. Under cover of war, they are escalating executions in order to create fear. And we must remember that the biggest threat to the Islamic Republic is not the US and Israeli military operations, as damaging and unlawful as they may be. It is the Iranian people first and foremost. So this is not just an attempt to instill terror, but it's also a regime that is fighting for its survival against the wishes of its own people.
Yeah, in many ways, it shows their weakness, and they are very fearful of the people of Iran. And you mentioned the protests that were taking place in Esfahan, and I was watching it live on social media, and my heart was racing, not only as someone of Iranian origin, but as someone whose family is originally from Esfahan. And just seeing the amount of people who showed up despite the risks, despite the fact that people have been killed and are being killed. And then I heard the call to prayer, and we knew that those two young men had been hanged. Why are people still taking the risks, despite the potential outcome here? What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me just how truly heroic the people of Iran are. We know that in January, many of the thousands that were killed were teenagers, 14, 15-year-olds, who were coming in the streets and being shot by snipers, by heavy machine guns. We had the horrific scenes of grieving mothers and fathers sifting through piles of black body bags in morgues, searching for their children. And now we have not just the scenes of protesters in the streets of Esfahan who are condemning these atrocious public hangings, but in Qazl Hisar prison, there was a massive hunger strike by those who are on death row. So we have protests in the prisons of Iran, never mind on the streets. And this is why I began by saying that Iranian people are the victims both of the Islamic Republic and of the foreign bombardment, but above all, they're victims of the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic has killed far more of its own citizens than any foreign power. And we have to really understand that ultimately, whatever the geopolitical struggles may be in the Middle East, that the empowerment of the people of Iran is essential, not just for the democratic transformation of their own country, but for the transformation of the entire region. The Iranian people are essentially rejecting hateful, violent, sectarian ideology that has undermined stability throughout the region, that has in turn fed into the extremism which has gripped the entire region, and transforming Iran into a secular democracy, which is the overwhelming wish of the Iranian people, which is being expressed in their heroic struggle, is not just the morally right cause to support, but even from the point of view of trying to achieve long-term peace and stability in the region, I would say it's an essential ingredient of the future that we have to try and build in the Middle East.
Yeah, you're right. It's simply the right thing to do. When does a campaign of executions go from being potentially a domestic issue to an international crime here? Like, what is the legal threshold that we're talking about?
It's a very good question. And I would begin by saying that a death sentence which is carried out without any due process and on legal grounds that are entirely unacceptable is not really a lawful execution. It becomes a form of murder or extrajudicial execution, because the idea of a lawful execution is that it has to be reserved for the most serious crimes such as murder, and only after scrupulous respect for fair trial guarantees. So what we actually have in Iran are arbitrary executions. These are killings. They are murders. There is no legal justification whatsoever for these killings. But of course, the killings are not in isolation from the widespread and systematic violence and repression that we have witnessed in recent months. And that is the quality that transforms what would otherwise simply be human rights violations into a crime against humanity. Article 7 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court defines crimes against humanity as a widespread or systematic attack directed against the civilian population. So what we're witnessing today in this a surge in executions is not an isolated phenomena. It is inextricably connected with the events of January, and it is really a continuation of the same criminal transaction.
And it's all connected to this, as you said, crimes against humanity.
Yes, the United Nations fact-finding mission already found, in respect of the Women, Life, Liberty movement in 2022, that qualified as a crime against humanity. So I'm not using this as a political slogan. This is the finding of a highly authoritative and impartial UN body. And the scale of the killings in January of this year were infinitely greater than what we witnessed in 2022. So one has to await the conclusions of the UN fact-finding mission, because it takes time to investigate and issue a proper report. But I have no doubt whatsoever that this would be a crime against humanity. And as I said in my testimony before the Human Rights Council at its special session on Iran in January, what we have specifically is the crime against humanity of extermination, which is the large-scale killing over 2 days of what could be as many as 30 to 35,000 people. We don't know the exact numbers because of the internet blackout, because of the repression of information, because many hospitals and clinics are being forced to record the cause of death as natural, as opposed to bullet wounds. We have many accounts of refrigerator trucks being used to dump bodies in what could be unmarked graves, which has happened once again in the past. and we were witness to the so-called Chief Justice of the Iranian highest court, Mohseni Ejei, and the Attorney General and others, describing the protesters once again as moharib, as those who wage war against God, which, according to their interpretation of the Sharia, justifies their killings. There were several statements in January by senior officials describing the protesters as combatants, what have you, CIA or Mossad operatives who can be killed with impunity. And there's overwhelming evidence also of not just snipers, but heavy machine guns, sometimes armored piercing bullets being fired from the back of trucks, being used against unarmed protesters. So when you put all of that together, I think there's no doubt that we have a crime against humanity, that specifically the case can be made that this is a crime of extermination, given the large scale of the killings. And ultimately, those who ordered and instigated these crimes are individually responsible and must be brought to justice, whether before the International Criminal Court or hopefully one day before the independent and impartial courts of a democratic Iran.
So then, speaking of that, who ultimately bears legal responsibility for these executions? Is it someone like Mohsen Ejei, the head of the judiciary in Iran? How does that process work, legally speaking?
Well, legally, as I said, those who order these crimes, those who ordered for protesters to be shot in the streets, those who have ordered the judiciary to use evidence obtained through torture, forced confessions, those who are authorizing the issuance of death sentences and having them carried out in circumstances where, as I said, they are arbitrary executions. They cannot be justified in any way as executions which are being carried out subject to fair trials. So those at the very top of the Islamic Republic leadership bear individual criminal responsibility, because these are not isolated human rights violations. We're not talking about a few bad guards in the prison who torture prisoners who are otherwise being treated humanely. You have a policy, and a long-standing one, of using violence and repression. And one day, hopefully, it will be possible to hold these individuals responsible.
And speaking of that one day, hopefully, how do you, in terms of prosecuting these types of individuals, what evidence needs to be preserved today before it gets lost? What advice do you have, given your experience with the former Yugoslavia?
Well, the good thing is that we established the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center in 2004 in the United States. And there was also the Burumand Foundation. And today there is a whole ecosystem of human rights organizations that are documenting these crimes. And of course, we now have the UN fact-finding mission in Geneva, which is also able to coalesce this massive amount of evidence and publish authoritative reports, which, among other things, address the question of individual criminal responsibility. And the fact-finding mission report had a confidential annex which included the names of senior officials of the Islamic Republic who were responsible for crimes against humanity in relation to the events of the Women, Life, Liberty movement. So getting back to your question, I think that the Iranians who are at least in the diaspora are able to collect what evidence they can. But ultimately, those within Iran, when they have the opportunity, should be collecting orders and instructions from senior officials which call for the commission of these abuses, whether those abuses are orders to kill people in the streets, the shoot to kill orders, some of which, as I said, were manifest from the public statements of officials who are saying the protesters are combatants. That is essentially a license to kill with impunity. But beyond that, I would say officials within the judiciary who are sentencing individuals who are clearly innocent to death, who are denying them any fair trial guarantees. One of the interesting trials before the military tribunals at Nuremberg is called the Justice Trial. And it was a prosecution of Nazi prosecutors and judges for carrying out death sentences and essentially applying the discriminatory laws of Nazi Germany. And it is not a defense to say that I was carrying out the laws of the states when those laws themselves qualify as crimes against humanity. So all this to say that the responsibility for these crimes extends first and foremost from those at the top who are pursuing this policy, and it carries all the way down to the willing executioners who are the torturers in the prisons or the hanging judges who are sentencing these young people to death for no reason.
Professor Akhavan, you used the term extermination. I'm just curious, how do you differentiate between extermination and genocide? Some people use that term sometimes interchangeably. Can you?
Yes and no. There may be some overlap between them, but they are distinct crimes. The crime of extermination, which emerged in the context of the Nuremberg Charter in 1945, describes essentially large-scale killing or mass killing. But genocide is when the intention, whether through mass killing or starvation or other such policies, is to destroy a specific group, which is limited to racial, ethnic, religious, or national groups. So in that sense, the crimes of the Islamic Republic, at least in the context of the protests, are not directed against specific groups to the extent, of course, that one can say, let's say, minorities such as the Kurds, the Baluch, the Baha'i, or others have been targeted. But I would say that the repression of the protests is not the crime of genocide, because the victims overwhelmingly are the Iranian people. They're not members of a specific ethnic, racial, religious, or other group. And that's the distinction. And genocide, of course, is used as a slogan very often because it's such a powerful term. But I think we need to be very careful and use these terms properly.
To conclude, Professor Akhavan, what is your message to the international community? As a journalist, I've come across a lot of folks, unfortunately, who deny that the massacre happened on January 8th and 9th. They say things like, oh, it's not possible for that amount of people to have been killed in 2 nights alone. This is made up. This is just propaganda by, foreign adversaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say to those individuals? Or even when it comes to the executions, I've heard some Americans say, well, we execute people in the United States.
Yeah, I think there is a profound problem in the media space today of individuals who are essentially ideologues, and they justify their ideological positions at the expense of empathy, at the expense of basic morality. And we need to understand that human rights are universal. Human rights are not an instrument which we can simply exploit whenever it is politically convenient. The reality is that there is no legitimacy to someone who tries to minimize, let alone deny, the scale of these killings, because they don't like President Trump, they don't like Prime Minister Netanyahu, or whatever the case may be. I think this is absurd and it's obscene, and I've seen it on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And we need to, I think, condemn that approach and basically understand, first and foremost, that we need to listen to the voice of those who suffer. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the victims of October 7th or Gaza or Syria or Iran or what have you. We need to create a world in which there is justice, there is respect for international law and human rights. And I would tell the international community not only to listen and amplify the cry of the Iranian people, but also to understand, as I said earlier, that there is no long-term peace and security in the Middle East without the democratic transformation of Iran. So the Iranian people are the biggest ally the international community has if it is seeking a long-term solution. And I would also say that for those who think that it is somehow ideologically correct on the progressive left to try and deny and minimize the massacre of innocent Iranian people, are feminists, are social activists, are labor unions, well, you need to really search your conscience and think, what does it mean to be on the political left? Is support for Islamic fascism in the context of gangster capitalism, one of the most corrupt, hyper-corrupt regimes, which has no respect for the rights of women, no respect for the rights of the working class, which imprisons labor union leaders and what have you. Is this what it means to be part of the progressive left? And I would go further and say that in some respects, I use the word very carefully, it is downright racist to say that, oh, well, these people in the Middle East, they don't want the freedoms that we have in the West. The women in Iran don't want to have equality. That is probably one of the most regressive and unfortunate positions imaginable. So I would simply say that the Iranian people want the same freedom that people have in the West. And whether or not the United States human rights record also has problems does not change the fact that Iran is on this execution binge. And there is simply no comparison. As much as one could condemn the use of executions in the United States, there is such a thing as a fair trial guarantee, appeals, and in addition to that, executions in the United States, in those states which still allow them, are limited to typically capital offenses such as murder. You don't have people being executed in the United States because they're critical of President Trump. So in any event, I really hope that those who make their living making provocative statements on social media search their conscience and ask themselves whether what they're doing really withstands moral scrutiny. And I'm sure that the day will come that those people will regret having turned their back to the plight of the Iranian people in this very difficult moment.
100%. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Professor Akhavan?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's truly, you do serve humanity, and we're so grateful and so proud to have you in our community, Professor Akhavan.
Well, thank you, Negar, but I'm humbled by the sacrifice of the youth that have given their lives in the streets, those that were hanged 2 days ago, and above all, the mothers and fathers grieving for the loss of their children. So it's the least that we can do is to try and be their voice before the world.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for being here. It's great to have you both on the show today. Tuesday morning on Fox and Friends, President Donald Trump said he would finish the job if the Iranian regime does not sign a deal. We've heard the president use that phrase several times, yet he hasn't exactly explained what he means by finish the job. From your perspective, what does finish the job mean in practical terms? Admiral Harward, we can start with you if you like.
Well, first and foremost, the Straits of Hormuz. Can Iran threaten, and will they threaten shipping and attack shipping going through the Straits? So that's first and foremost. He's got to ensure they don't pose a threat, not only in their intent, but their capabilities against shipping. So I would say in that lane, it's a recognition, maybe a document that acknowledges, if you need the long-term solution, a signed document where they acknowledge that the Straits of Hormuz are international waterway, and that way they will not attack or threaten it. So that would be first and foremost. And then there are other components, but I think that's what the regime is focused on first and foremost.
And what do you think, Blaise? What does he mean by finish the job? Is it with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, or are we moving beyond that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Admiral Harward that right now the strait is priority number one for the United States. It has to be opened, and it has to be opened by the United States in a way that makes clear to all parties that it is safe to pass through there, and that Iran is not going to try to reimpose any sort of control over that waterway. But I think when President Trump says finish the job, he does mean something beyond that. This war started, and in fact, the priority for U.S. policy going back over 20 years across multiple administrations from both parties has been a concern about Iran's nuclear program. And I don't think that President Trump would consider this war concluded until steps have been taken to ensure that Iran will not obtain a nuclear weapon. And it seems that he is once again offering Iran a diplomatic off-ramp to negotiate a deal which would see an end to its nuclear ambitions. And failing that, I think what President Trump is referring to is continued military options to ensure that Iran does not have the means to pursue a nuclear weapon.
Admiral, why offer more time, as Blaise has just mentioned, given the Iranian regime's behavior, mentality, their past and their present?
That's a great question, because I don't believe it plays in his favor completely, but there is a strategy where you realize that the financial pressure that's building Iran, the fact that they have no flow of oil, they're not selling their oil, which is their primary revenue, is having an impact in and of itself. So time works in his behavior or in his favor for that. I would add, though, there's more he could do in that lane. I'd like to see them shut down the airspace. I'd like them to shut down the borders. I mean, completely isolate Iran financially could be and should be and probably is more powerful than the military strikes. But back to that first option, as Blaise talked about, number two is definitely the nuclear issue. And I think handing over the material and agreeing, again, in some sort of documentation that they won't pursue a nuclear weapon. But the other components that I think is the end state everyone's looking through and linked to the straits is their missile and drone programs, making sure that is completely eradicated and they don't pose a threat to anyone, much less the straits, but other nations, the other Arab countries, as they've illustrated, going after their infrastructure, going after our bases and our people, and then finally funding the surrogates. So those are the other end states everyone, I believe, is looking for. And I think the president recognizes that. And as I'm seeing here in D.C., starting to build that political support to move towards that end state, understanding the risk that these Arab nations face from those missiles and drones.
And can you expand on that in terms of how he's building that political support that you mentioned?
Sure. You're seeing Saudi, you're seeing UAE, you're seeing Qatar, Kuwait take active roles or in support with a change of pace of understanding that the U.S. is going to stay till that end state, the broader end state, is met. They have always been concerned that we would come in, strike Iran, and leave them in a much more powerful position and presenting long-term threats to them. So with a commitment to see this through till the government of Iran no longer pursues any of those programs and policies, then they'll jump on board and be in support of the effort, both politically, financially, and militarily. And I think you're seeing that come to fruition now.
And going back to that point of finish the job, and I'm putting an emphasis on it only because I know folks in the Iranian diaspora, for example, when they hear President Trump say that, in their minds, they're not thinking Strait of Hormuz, they're not thinking nuclear, they're thinking finish the job as literally finishing off this regime. And this morning, Tuesday morning on Fox and Friends, he followed that statement, President Trump, with, I can destroy Iran's bridges, infrastructure, power plants, but that he wouldn't do that because he wants to spare and have mercy on the people of Iran. Number one, how would those types of targets, I mean, what would that achieve politically speaking? And number two, the Iranian regime has made it clear they don't care for the people of Iran. And many analysts say that they will do anything to stay in power, even if that means risking, bridges and infrastructure and the power plants. So how does a U.S. president sparing the lives of the Iranian people, how does that create leverage here? Blaise or Admiral, whoever would like to go first, but I'd love to hear from both of you on this.
Again, his strategy, and one thing is good or bad, whether you like it or not, no one's known exactly what the president is going to do. And that's been successful in confusing the government of Iran, but it's also confused a lot of allies in the region as well. So there's pluses and minuses. I think what he's trying to do is reinforce the financial strangulation. So if you take out that, and let me add to that, the topography of Iran is very important. The mountains, the ridges make some of these roads and bridges the only route of approach into some of these cities. So when you take that out, it significantly impacts not only their commerce, but also impacts their military. And in advance of a land force going in, that presents some challenges to it. But in the long run, it also further reinforces the financial impact the Iranian people will deal with, because when the regime is changed, a lot of resources will be dedicated to rebuilding the nation and getting their economy back on track. So it's a strategy that plays out indifferently on both sides, but it reinforces both the military options and the financial impact it has on the government of Iran.
Blaise, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, I share the hopes of the Iranian people that finishing the job means what President Trump said on February 28th of this year, which is, creating the conditions for the Iranian people to seize the opportunity to shape their own destiny and seize their own freedom. That should be the ultimate goal of U.S. policy. Unfortunately, President Trump, I think, shifted away from that early in the campaign. And I'm not seeing indications that he has come back to that as the objective that he is pursuing right now. And I do think that when he talks about hitting some of those targets, those infrastructure targets that Admiral Harward talked about, it is with the mind to have this regime around for the foreseeable future and make sure that if it is going to stick around, if it isn't going to collapse, if it isn't going to be overthrown, then at least we can deny it the revenue, the sources of commerce with which to both enrich itself and fuel and fund its nuclear program, its campaign of terror, both against the Iranian people and the region. And so I think talking about this, going after energy infrastructure, some of the transport infrastructure, yes, that is a form of leverage and pressure against the regime, but it's also would be an insurance policy that would make it much harder for this regime to rebuild and reemerge as a threat on the assumption that they're going to stick around. That might be an important aspect of weakening the regime, but I think it really needs to be paired with support, American support, allied support for the Iranian people, for the Iranian opposition. And going back to some of what we saw at the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, which is really targeting regime leadership, the security establishment, the security apparatus, to try to give the Iranian people the chance that they need to take back their own government.
Admiral, why did the objective change somewhere down the line, as Blaise had mentioned?
That is the million-dollar question. And like Blaise said, at the very start of this campaign, Epic Fury, the president made it clear he was looking for total surrender by the regime. And I think, though, considering the straits and the impact it had on international commerce, he wanted to give it time. And he accomplished getting all the ships and oil that was trapped in the Gulf at the initial thing that were in there for months. They were able to get out during this period. So I think that was some of it. He gave the international community, international commerce a chance to get out, but understand the new world. And no one's going in without the understanding that they couldn't be trapped there for a while. So he reset the standard, and by seeing that negotiations weren't going anywhere and that they attacked our people and killed our people, I think he came to the realization negotiations aren't going to happen. We've just got to get capitulation. So I think that's what the realization of the president, and now it's full steam ahead, I hope, in that lane where we'll maximize all the elements of political, economic, and military power to really force the regime to have a change of the regime, and not driven externally, maybe internally. When the artists are not being paid, when the police aren't being paid, when it gets to that level of financial strangulation, maybe you'll see the internal dynamics be as powerful as the external dynamics.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about that because we're having executions inside of Iran. We saw in Esfahan that they were set to execute 3 individuals. They executed at least 2 of them. There are reports that the other individual may have had a heart attack out of fear, just people out protesting to prevent these executions, the regime going after them. So how do you see the relationship between external military pressure and the regime's internal crackdown? Admiral, I'll start with you.
Well, that's the part I've always said, and I still think we need to focus on. I think that's the point we're starting. When this campaign first started, you saw our Israeli partners focus on the IRGC and leadership, and you saw the U.S. focused on missiles and drones, all through really military power. I think now, hopefully, there'll be a synchronization, not only Israel, U.S., other Arab leaders, and even Europeans who can bring something to the fight, both politically, build coalitions, as you're hearing now that Europe and the Brits are bringing ships into the blockade. So you're going to build that political consensus and that financial, but are we going to leverage all those elements of intelligence, networks we have to align and synchronize internal activity with external activities, such as the strikes and bombings? So I think that's the real change you're going to see in this campaign. And I think if we really bring the full might with the flexibility and adaptability that our current command and control and those assets do, I think you can do this aligned with some of the political goals, be it the midterm, that the president needs. So I'm very optimistic we're going to respond, and the president will finally help is on the way for those 75 million Iranians who have suffered miserably and want to see the regime change. And hopefully we're here to help them and team together to bring this to fruition.
Admiral, you just spoke of leverage. How much leverage does each side have right now? President Trump says the Iranians are desperate for a deal. The Iranians at least are projecting that time is on their side. In their view, at least that's what they're projecting out there. How do you assess the balance of leverage today compared to January when the massacre happened inside of Iran, or even February at the start of the war?
No, I think the administration controls all the leverage right now. And as soon as they can eradicate those missiles and drones, then they own the country. There's no threat to our bases, our allies. We can do whatever we want. And so it's back to that opening up the straits and eradicating, taking off those missiles and drones out of the equation. Once that's done, they own Iran for all intent and purposes. And back to if you're going to put U.S. boots on the ground, the biggest risk isn't from the Artish and IRGC. It's from those drones and missiles that would be turned inward. So again, getting rid of them, and I'm surprised we have not been able to do that over this long conflict, then the tide really turns. So the U.S. controls all the avenues, with that being the primary objective to ensure minimizing risk to other options.
I had a follow-up question to that, Admiral, because there are reports that underground there are missiles the size of cities. How can the U.S. manage to eradicate that threat?
Well, once we find them, we can get them, regardless of where they are. There's entrances to tunnels. We have buster bunkers. We have other modes. So the whole thing, and this is something that's been a problem for decades that needs to be solved, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that has wide area surveillance so we can watch wide areas of ground real time so that when something launches, we know that location, we can go after and target it. So again, the issue here is targeting, finding them to know where we are. When we solve that, we can address the capacity issue these weapons pose.
I wanted to get to Israel's role now. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Tuesday met with President Trump. Blaise, before meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, again, during that Fox and Friends interview, President Trump said, "I don't need Bibi to tell me about Pickaxe Mountain." How do you read that remark?
Yeah, so maybe if I could just comment on the previous questions really quickly.
Please do, yeah.
I think the greatest weapon that we have in this fight against Iran, the weapon that Iran is most afraid of, is the Iranian people, which is why we've seen them to continue and expand their crackdown during the war. With the executions you talked about, continued arrests and jailings and beatings of dissidents and anybody that they fear might be involved in anti-regime activity. I think that speaks volume as to how fragile the regime is and how scared it is of the Iranian people. And to Admiral Harward's point, the U.S. has all the leverage. It could have even more leverage if it were able to harness the power of the Iranian people and support it. I think that would give us truly the upper hand in this conflict. But to your question, President Trump has spoken about the threat of Pickaxe Mountain. Previously, a couple weeks ago, he already pointed it out as an emerging challenge, as an emerging center of gravity for Iran's nuclear program. We've had reports that Iran is now moving centrifuges into the facility. They might already have a stockpile of enriched uranium there, and talked about the possibility of hitting it. In fact, my colleague, Jonathan Rui, just had an op-ed in the New York Post talking about how the U.S. has the military options, if not to destroy the facility, then to at least try to render it inoperable. And I think President Trump already knows all of that. I think he has the intelligence from the United States. He has the options from his military planners as to how to go about it. And I think what he was communicating is that the United States and Israel are on the same page about this threat, that he recognizes the threat that Pickaxe poses, that he recognizes the continued threat of Iran's nuclear program, and that neutralizing that program remains a core priority. As we said, when he talks about finishing the job, that has to include the nuclear program. And I think he knows that. And in that regard, the United States and Israel are certainly on the same page.
And so you feel that they're still closely aligned despite what some media reports are out there about Netanyahu and Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see these reports all the time. We saw them in March and April and May of last year that Bibi and Trump were fighting, that Bibi kept asking to go to war against Iran and Trump kept telling him no. And then we saw the 12-day war and the United States coming in support of Israeli Operation Rising Lion with Operation Midnight Hammer. We saw those same reports throughout this war, despite the fact that the United States and Israel were fighting shoulder to shoulder against the same threat. So I think there is a continued attempt to try to show that there is distance between the United States and Israel. And certainly there are some differences in what their core interests are. The United States, for example, cares a whole lot about opening the Strait of Hormuz, which isn't necessarily an issue for Israel. But I think when it comes to the perception of Iran as a threat, when it comes to the objective of preventing a nuclear Iran, when it comes to the willingness to use military force to do that if needed, then I think there is no daylight between the United States and Israel, or between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, for that matter. And I would just say that we should recognize that this is the last grand gesture of Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the last stalwarts in the U.S. Senate, the last champions of an engaged United States that stood fiercely against its adversaries like Iran, and staunchly with its friends like Israel and Ukraine. That even in death, even on the day of his funeral, he is serving to bring together U.S. partners like Israel, like Ukraine, like our Gulf partners, bringing them to Washington, bringing them to meet with President Trump and each other, and find a common way forward. I think this is a great testament to the legacy of Senator Graham, and yet another reason that we should all be thankful to him.
Yeah, that was a very beautiful moment indeed. Admiral, any thoughts on what we were just talking about in terms of Israel's relationship with the United States and how aligned they are? And I also wanted to ask you, how do you measure whether President Trump's strategy is working? Given your background, what are you looking for?
Well, I think it's the same answer for both questions. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't the partnership with Israel, and we won't meet our end objective without that partner. And the same thing with President Trump. We wouldn't be here without President Trump having the courage to take this on after 47 years. And I think we're going to see that he will see this through. So on all those things, our partnerships are strong. It's served us well. It will serve us well being forward. And it's just indicative of finally addressing a long-term threat that will be solved now. And if not, creates a much longer long-term problem. So I remain very optimistic of both.
And Admiral, even if Iran's nuclear facilities are obliterated and its military is weakened, how do you prevent Tehran from rebuilding, let's say 10 years from now? What has to happen for this to be more than just a pause in the cycle?
It's about change of government, without a doubt. You need a government in Iran that renounces the Islamic Revolution and what it stood for the last 48 years, and the policies and programs went with it. And instead, using those resources to build Iran, to provide liberty to its people so they can live their lives, and not suffer under a regime that's leveraged those resources to threaten the region. So I think at the end of the day, that's what this is going to serve. A change of government in Tehran has to be the ultimate end state that's focused on supporting and being representative of its people, not oppressing them and killing them as they've done for decades.
Blaise, your thoughts on that, and also how do you see Israel's role going forward if the war reopens?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Admiral Harward on this. Look, the name of the problem is not Iran's nuclear program. It's not Iran's missiles and drones. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so long as that regime is in power, we're going to continue to be under threat. Israel's going to continue to be under threat. The Gulf Arab countries are going to continue to be under threat. And the Iranian people are going to live under the Islamic Republic's boot. And that just means that some version of what we just went through for the last 4 months is going to repeat. I don't know if it's every year, every 3 years, every 5 years, every 10 years, but it's going to keep going on. We're going to have another October 7th. We're going to have another Operation Epic Fury so long as the Islamic Republic is in power, because the only way to stop the Islamic Republic from rebuilding, as you asked, is to go to war with them, to take out their capabilities, just as we've done during Operation Epic Fury. And the only way to stop that cycle is to get rid of the regime. And so hopefully that will be the final outcome and the final objective of U.S. policy this go around. And if it's not this time around, then it will have to be the time after that or the time after that. Sooner or later, we'll realize, just like we had to realize with the Soviet Union, that working to create the conditions for its collapse is the only way that the United States and its partners and the rest of the world can be safe. And I think Israel has a tremendous role to play in that, whether it's militarily, the fact that we have been able to degrade Iran's military capabilities and the threat it poses to the world is because Israel, going back to October 2024 and June of 2025, and now in 2026, has taken out Iranian air defenses, opening the skies and the path for Israeli and U.S. jets to fly at will over Iran. It's Israel that had the intelligence that allowed for the elimination of the supreme leader and numerous members of Iran's security establishment and nuclear program. It's Israel that has the intelligence and capabilities that went after IRGC and Basij forces. And so I think whether it's through continued military operations, through intelligence, or through ultimately a political strategy to support Iran's opposition, Israel is going to be the key to carrying out the strategy.
And Admiral, in terms of the militarily speaking, how do you distinguish between a strategy that's designed to change the regime's behavior and one that intentionally or not begins to change the conditions under which the regime itself survives?
Well, that's exactly what the president has done. And that's what he sure kept the Iranians guessing on this thing. Understand that leaves them the options to all of them, but most importantly, he is pursuing all of them, but not letting the enemy know when or where. So their voice and their strategy is adapting to his and not vice versa. And that's another big change in the game here. In the past, negotiations, waiting things out, waiting for a change in administration is all part of the Iranian regime. So while he got them to focus on the straits or the nuclear issue, he was setting the stage for the bigger accomplishments as well, undermining the surrogates, going after the missiles and drones. So again, I think it's been a sound strategy. Where we are on that journey is somewhat dictated by what they have left, as you talked about, those missiles and drones. But once that's a goal, he can work through all the objectives on any timeline he may want to dictate, eradicating their ability to project power and reduce threats. Or present threats to our allies and region. So again, it becomes his timeline. I think it's been a sound strategy.
And just to conclude, I wanted to ask both of you, Blaise, I'll start with you and then the Admiral, where are we headed next?
I think that's another $1 million question here. I think what we're seeing President Trump try to move towards is now a concerted political multinational strategy focused on reopening the strait. I think what we've been seeing in and around Senator Graham's funeral, the convening of various partners, both from the Gulf and now talking with the Europeans, the UK is getting involved, is an attempt to put together a multinational force that would enter and patrol the strait, daring Iran to attack a British warship or a Saudi ship, sort of making it much harder for Iran to make this a war against the United States or Israel, and showing that there is a concerted international coalition and international consensus that the strait has to be open. And so I do think we're shifting maybe now to more of a political strategy, and hoping, I think President Trump has said that there are negotiations ongoing, which the Iranians dispute, but I think he's at least trying to give room for diplomacy to yield an outcome on preventing a nuclear Iran. But I think failing that, President Trump has made clear over and over again that if diplomacy fails, if he thinks he's not getting a good deal, he will go back to using the military option. And I think there are also currently being plans drawn up for just how and when to do that, particularly with Israel.
A lot more in store. Admiral?
I agree with everything my shipmate has just said, with two caveats. I wish we dropped the term negotiations. It's just capitulation agreement. Here's what you're going to do. Either do it or we keep going. So that's first and foremost. And then what I hope he's starting to pursue is a boots on the ground option. Not for occupation, but just another raid, not dissimilar, but maybe a larger scale than they did to recover the U.S. pilot. You go in, raid a city, clear it out. That's a sign, a strong signal to the people of Iran, and completely undermines the regime's confidence and really could become one of those triggering events. So you ask what's next. I think they're preparing that option unless they capitulate negotiations are over. They agree to shutting, not threatening the Straits, agreeing to that, handing over the materials, and the other clear objective we're not negotiating more. Agree and do it, or we're going to continue these military and economic options that the president has. I think he's preparing both of those as we speak.
Well, then I have to ask you, was cutting off Bandar Abbas by cutting off the transportation and the bridges and essentially cutting this off from the rest of Iran, is that in preparation then for boots on the ground, potentially starting in the south?
Well, could be. Let's hope so. Bandar Abbas, I'd go Josk myself. It's outside the Gulf, a little less risk, harder for them to target. But just, I think any of those associations, you kind of see the preparation of the battlefield. You're seeing some assets moved in position. So yes, I think that's a very viable option.
Yeah, and it would give a lot of hope to the people of Iran who would then say, okay, President Trump is serious about getting rid of this brutal, repressive regime. Because I think the big fear for the people of Iran is, okay, if they give in to the demands of the United States, but they continue to let out their aggression on the vulnerable population, the people of Iran.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that was most unsettling to me, at least, about the MOU that we signed in June, is that it included a provision saying that the United States would not interfere in Iranian domestic affairs, when that's precisely what the United States should be doing. It should be precisely standing with and for the Iranian people. That's how all of this started, going back to January. And I think honoring that promise that President Trump made, as the Admiral remarked, that help is on the way. That help should still be coming, and I hope that it will be coming in the next phase of this Iran strategy.
Yeah, and Admiral, I wanted to ask you, you spent many years in Iran before the revolution. Emotionally, on a personal level, what is it like watching all of this unfold from afar?
Oh, it breaks my heart. It's broken my heart for 47 years. Such an incredible country, incredible people. And to see them oppressed, see them murdered in the streets with such potential for the country and the people breaks my heart. That's why I'm so encouraged. I'm so optimistic that Iran can really reach its potential as an international country, become a part of the world economy, the commerce, and to see the Iranian people prosper again is really what this is all about. And if we do that, the whole region will be really one of the hubs of the world because of the energy, the capacity, the intellectual capacity, and the numbers. You're talking about 95 million people who want to be part of the world economy and world society, and they've been denied that for 47 years. And the impact that has on Russia and China is exponentially significant to us over the long term. So, yeah, I'm emotionally tied to this, but for all the right reasons, may add. Fate played a very interesting role in my life to be here at this time and help message to make sure that American people understand how important it is to them and that the support we can provide the Iranian people is one of the best returns on investment that America and our partners can make.
It is the best return on investment. Thank you so much to you both for joining me today on Eye for Iran.
Thank you
for having us.
A Ukrainian strike in the Caspian Sea killed a sailor aboard an Iranian vessel. Ukraine said the ship was carrying military equipment between Iran and Russia. Iranian officials said it was a commercial vessel. Russia said that this should be seen as a direct attack on Iran. Ultimately, both Iranian and Ukrainian officials chose de-escalation. But how do we view all of this in the grand scheme of things? This is where we bring in our experts. Thank you so much to you both for being here. Just wanted to get started on how do you view all of this, as I said, in the grand scheme of things, meaning the Iran and the U.S.-Israel war and Russia's war in Ukraine. Alex, we can start with you.
Sure, Nagar, it's great to be with you and with Nicole. Look, my quick, big take on this is it's too early to say exactly what the intention was. at least a different interpretation, certainly if you're sitting in Tehran. And that's my focus. I tend to just spend more time trying to figure out what the Iranians are making of it. And they don't seem clearly, from what I can tell, clear what this was meant to signal. I think overall, they don't read this as an Ukrainian effort to sort of broaden and bring Iran into the war on the side of Russia against Ukraine. More likely a signal to Iran from the US, from the West, probably aimed at saying that your northern front, if you're looking at ways to sort of break the blockade on Iran's southern ports by looking at increasing trade to your north, maybe you should think again, because that's also within reach. U.S. has already hit a rail connection up in the northeast that connects Iran to China through Central Asia. So obviously this is an issue that's on the minds of American policy, military planners. And now you have the Ukrainians get involved. But then we've seen Ukraine very quickly sort of downplaying this. I want to move on. So maybe this was a signal. Ukraine was used, if you will. Not that Ukraine doesn't have issues with the Islamic Republic. They clearly do, because Iran early on got into this war supporting the Russians militarily with the drones, as we know. But the point is, those drones are being mostly made in Russia today. So Iran isn't necessarily a must-have from Russia's point of view in the war against Ukraine, which raises the question, why would Kiev then risk it? So that is why perhaps the Iranians are thinking this was the West, the United States, the Europeans using Ukraine as a way of sending a signal to Iran, and also to the Russians in as far as the future of the so-called northern trade routes to the world are concerned.
And Nicole, do you see this as messaging? And do you feel like Alex is saying that the United States and the West are behind this?
I mean, it's unclear who is beyond the Ukrainians, if there's any other actors kind of pushing for these kind of strikes. But what did seem evident from this, and actually from some of the Ukrainian intelligence leakages from this war, is that they're really trying to show how involved the Russians have been in Iranian targeting or in Iranian military action, and how the Russians are really facilitating or at least supporting a lot of what we see as some of the more escalatory parts on behalf of Iran. These ships in the Caspian have been targeted before from the Ukrainians. It wasn't clear if the previous shipments, it was about a year ago, if that was about military shipments. But with this, I think that the clear purpose of it from the Ukrainian side was to really highlight how involved both Russia and Iran are in their kind of respective wars, and how they both are kind of parties to these two different wars. So I think that was an effort there. I'm not too sure if this was coordinated with the United States. I mean, clearly the Caspian is an important conduit for Russia-Iran trade and also Russia-Iran sanctions evasion, and the majority of the main shipments of military support through there. So in some sense, it could be viewed as signaling. It also could be viewed much larger in terms of what Ukraine is actually thinking about their battle against the Russians, and whether or not showing the linkage with Iran would be more beneficial to garner at least more support and potentially more packages for Patriot interceptors, which they do need right now.
So if it wasn't if it wasn't done in coordination with the United States, who do you feel that if at all, it could have been done in coordination with?
I have no proof of this. I have no real substantial evidence here, but Israel did hit a facility. They hit Anzali during the war during this current war, and they've shown a long interest in also the kind of linkages between the Russians and the Iranians in the Caspian Sea. You did see the Ukrainian and Israeli foreign ministers have a phone call shortly after the strikes, but it's not a definitive linkage. If anything, they are aligned on the kind of Iranian threat, less so on the Russian threat, because Israel still has ties with the Russians, but that could have been, I think, maybe a factor too.
Yeah, and during Lindsey Graham's ceremony in the United States, you could see Zelensky and Netanyahu having a very heated conversation that was definitely caught on cameras. So I wanted to ask both of you, Alex, I'll start with you, and then Nicole, do you see Ukraine playing out as a proxy then, potentially of either the United States, of Israel, or of both in this war against Iran?
I want to echo what Nicole said. So much of what I just told you was essentially a summary of what I think is the sort of dominant narrative emerging in Iran. But that is important to remember. It's an Iranian semi-official, at best, Iranian narrative. The objective, independent data that we would need as analysts to, concretely point one way or another just isn't there. So we're speculating, we're trying to make sense of this, and it is early days. But look, take a step back. Ukraine is in this war against the Russian aggression. The Russians invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for its integrity as a nation state. And in that effort, they have been backed by the Europeans throughout, and mostly by the United States, certainly during the Biden administration. And for that reason, as an analyst, not falling for Iranian narratives, I would just ask myself, could Ukraine make a decision that could be pretty consequential if it got out of hand without coordinating with close allies in places like London and Berlin and Paris and so on? Never mind Washington. And I just have a hard time believing that Ukrainian would just go ahead and do this on their own. So some kind of coordination, I would assume happened, just because when I look at the big picture where Ukraine is, and Ukraine is not right now fighting existential war against Iran, it's fighting one against Russia. And for that, they have Western support by and large. It would be an open question if they would have open support, if they wanted to sort of start opening a new front against the Iranians, which obviously is not what the Ukrainians are interested in, which takes us back to that original point I made, which signaling might make a lot of sense. And Nicole, let me also point out, look, the Caspian Sea being militarized is not an Iranian problem. It's a problem for a lot of the littoral states. It's a problem for, let me give you an example, for Azerbaijan. Who is Azerbaijan's biggest foreign partner? It's the country of Turkey. Turkey is not going to look too kind on, energy pipelines that are traveling east-west, bringing a lot of energy to Europe, to Turkey. Commercial Turkish interests are great, suddenly being put at risk. So what could happen in a worst-case scenario is the militarization of the Caspian Sea. That is not in the interest of vast majority of, I would say, with the exception of, I won't name names, but I don't actually think of anybody out there who would be benefiting from militarization of the Caspian. So again, if you're Ukraine, you know that. That's not a surprise that Baku is going to get upset, that Ankara is going to get upset, that the Central Asians are going to get upset, that the Chinese, because they're committed to the so-called middle corridor, which is still an aspiration of sorts as of today, but it's, people are genuinely talking about investing in the middle corridor, bringing trade from the East to Europe. You suddenly have firing, a match going on in the Caspian where Iran blows up, vessels that are associated with the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians return the favor in kind. I can't see that being something that the Russians, the Iranians, the Central Asians, the South Caucasus would be interested in. For that reason, again, I go back, and the Ukrainians would have known that. So one-off signaling. Listen, you're within reach. We're watching, you're within reach. Don't think this is your insurance policy to get out of the American blockade to your south. That makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, it starts geopolitically to raise many uncomfortable questions. If you're Ukraine, then it actually provides advantages for Kyiv.
Yeah, it seems like escalation is in no one's favor. Nicole, what do you think about the potential for Ukraine possibly being viewed as a proxy?
I mean, I think it's important to separate the two wars. I mean, there are cross-cutting linkages between the two of them, but they're completely different theaters. But when the outset of the 22 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you actually saw a lot of Iranian commentators, and this was published in their parliamentary research reports, actually portraying that war as a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Mm-hmm. And so that's interesting. They kind of initially portrayed it as that. And of course, their supply of UAVs or drones to the Russians kind of, involved them in that. And so for them, at least at the outset, this was the way that the Iranians kind of portrayed the war, and kind of as a coming decline of the West and NATO. I don't think that this is going to necessarily turn into, Iran becoming far more involved in the war in Ukraine. They're already quite involved, and every night Ukrainian civilians, face the terror of the Shahed drones over their territory, and it's really caused much damage. But what was interesting, and this kind of got me thinking, is what Alex was talking about European governments. And, when there was a lot of concern that Iran might launch a strike against Ukraine in retaliation for this, for me, it kind of looked like two things. On one hand, it would be to show the Ukrainians they could hit back, but also it would be a signal to European governments, because Iran would definitely have the range to launch this. And obviously, the ballistic missile concern is something that's far more salient and felt strongly in European capitals. So in that sense, there was kind of this dual messaging. You could interpret it that way. But beyond them being connected and having similar technology and similar actors, and two wars that have gone astray for both the ones who initially got involved in them, there's the similarities there, but I don't see either of them becoming proxy wars for each other.
And how has that evolved, that convergence? Has it evolved or grown at all in your view? Because you talked about 2022, Iran entered that war essentially by providing the drones to Russia. The U.S. accuses Iran of providing short-range missiles as well. And now you've got the Ukrainians. They've developed anti-drone technology that they're providing to these Arab states in the Persian Gulf who are facing missile attacks from the Iranians. So how has it potentially changed over time?
Well, I mean, the war changed. I think UAVs and drones have been really important for the war in Ukraine. And a lot of that, initially derived from the Shaheds that the Russians took, domestically produced, upgraded, and also integrated into their strike packages in ways that could complicate or saturate air defenses. There is not definitive evidence that the Russians have provided that back to the Iranians, but just based off of some of the performance in the Gulf, it does seem like maybe there were some lessons shared at the very least between the Iranians and the Russians. So that's something that changed. I think it also transformed the Russia-Iran relationship in terms of military to military ties. And that was already set forth with the Syrian civil war, but it really intensified after Ukraine. And I do wonder if you would see Russia as involved in this current war with Iran, had it not been for the kind of partnership that they forged during the war in Ukraine and mutual isolation and all of these, multiple channels that they have in order to manage sanctions evasion and military transfers. So I think that kind of sense of it transformed, or at least impacted, what we see today.
What do you think, Alex, in terms of the evolution of this, I guess, convergence of these two separate wars?
It takes me back to the beginning of the war and the decision. Again, this was during the Biden administration. So there was a hope, at least in some quarters in Tehran, that, the Iranians and the Biden administration could go back to something that looked at JCPOA, undo the maximum pressure campaign of the first Trump administration. They were obviously struggling to resume the diplomatic track when President Biden was in the White House, but nonetheless, not all doors had been shut. And then Iran decides to go ahead and do this extremely provocative act of providing drones to Russia. They didn't need to do that. And that was basically the message of many inside Iran at the time. Like, what are we doing? We don't need to help the Russians. What Russia is doing in Ukraine, I remember vividly, different than what Saddam Hussein did to Iran in 1980. Using the same kind of pretext to launch a war. And now we are on the side of the aggressor, in that case, Russia. So this has been, a big part of the conversation in Iran, because not only was it, something that was questionable from that sort of moral point of view, if you will, but it also geopolitically didn't make sense because it just turned so many of the Europeans against Iran, because Europeans consider the Ukraine war something that is right outside their doorsteps, and they did not like what Iran was doing. So in many ways, the Iranians undermined their own main strategic objective, which is the lifting of sanctions, by going ahead and engaging in this transactional kind of a deal with Russia by providing drones, and essentially, without saying so, by siding with the Russians. They tried to sort of engage in this balancing act. They think it's convincing. For example, they haven't recognized Crimea as part of Russia, nor have they ever recognized places like Abkhazia or South Ossetia, part of Russia. So they, on the one hand, they don't want to, be seen like, I don't know, Belarus when it comes to relations with Russia, not that level of proximity. And yet in their actions, they were harmed themselves. I mean, Iran literally lost the Europeans because they stopped pushing for that diplomatic resumption when the Biden administration was there because of the things that Iran was doing vis-a-vis Russia and other files. So I would say the evolution has been one of, a continuation of the mindset of the individual who's no longer with us, Ali Khamenei, but his big gamble on Russia, going back decades as supreme leader, that you're better off with Russia because you might get something tangible out of them. Whereas with the West, you never know because they have all sorts of demands when it comes to Iran. That the West essentially is not able to live with the Islamic Republic in its current identity, whereas the Russians have no problems with that. So it's much more of a manageable relationship. But as I said, this is a war that Iran could have stayed out of. Other countries have handled the situation in the Russian-Ukraine war much better than the Iranians. I think I have done. And right now, my final point, Nagar, in terms of Russia helping the Iranians in terms of targeting and so forth, look, if you are Russia and you look at the war in Ukraine, my understanding is they do is a proxy war against NATO. They're not fighting Ukrainians, they're fighting NATO. If that's your Russian reading, then the war that the United States has waged now on Iran since 28th of February is an opportunity to pay the Americans, at least the Americans, back in kind, if you will. So you got us sucked in, and we will try and do our best to suck you in here in the Middle East. And that, by the way, might divert attention that the United States otherwise could have invested in the Ukraine war. So from that point of view, as sinister and cynical as that sounds, but it might make sense.
Would Iran continue to go with this gamble, as you put it, after this strike in the Caspian Sea, or would it potentially change their calculus maybe?
They have to be very careful. Iran is a large country. It's twice the size of Texas. For you to take your military assets that are constantly under monitoring and threat and have to basically dilute your campaign, move more assets away from the south, where the war is right now being waged. I mean, Iran is fighting the war in the Persian Gulf region. For you to have to divert attention to the north because suddenly it's a new front, it doesn't make sense. Again, it becomes a distraction, which might actually be very well the reason why the Ukrainians, if they did coordinate it with the Americans, wanted to also signify to Iran that don't get too comfortable thinking the war is just going to be waged to your south and you're going to hit U.S. bases from Kuwait to Oman and that's it. You are a large country, but you have also other ways for us to sort of put pressure on you, including in north. And again, I'm speculating, but one could maybe also take that into account.
Nicole, do you think the Iranians got the message then?
I mean, it's unclear who was the message directed to and which part of the Iranian establishment at the moment received that. I think, there is a difficulty in figuring out, who's really in charge when it comes to certain files in Iran. I think that the follow-on kind of de-escalation between the Iranians and the Ukrainians was probably the position that at least is what most parts of the government are going to be taking now. I would say, and partly because what we have been saying is this, and overall, like this is a detrimental factor for Iran is if the Caspian becomes a hot conflict and if there is an escalation there, this would divert attention from the Persian Gulf, and it would also just exhaust resources. So I think it's in their best favor or best kind of position at the moment not to kind of embroil themselves in that kind of conflict. However, if there are parts of the missile force that have, acted quite rogue throughout this war, you saw the targeting of Turkey, the targeting of Azerbaijan at parts during the war. I mean, it's unclear what's the level of command and control when it comes to parts of the missile force at the moment and if it's been centralized or re-centralized. So I wouldn't discount that kind of possibility for potential escalation elsewhere. But at the moment, it seems like at least the official policy is like heading towards de-escalation on the side of the Caspian.
I just want to conclude by asking you both about Russia's role. As we mentioned before, Russia came out to call this a direct attack on Iran. Yet during much of the Iran war, Russia appears at least to have been, remained silent, but now they're speaking out. Nicole and then Alex will end with you. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, there's a clear difference between what Russia says diplomatically and what they're doing behind the scenes. Even in their statements towards a lot of American Gulf allies that Russia has close ties to, it's been a little bit more pro-Iranian than typically you would see from the Russians, which is a shift. And they've been a bit more accusatory about the role of U.S. bases than they would have been, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. Behind the scenes, the level of coordination, not all of it has been unveiled yet. Not all of it is disclosed. But from what we know is the satellite intelligence, and that requires at least some kind of coordination within the Russian SVR, so their Foreign Intelligence Service, and also various intelligence entities in Iran. Their potential support when it comes to shipment of components, which who knows what were on these ships that were targeted, but that's also something. These are pretty important incremental upgrades that can improve Iran's ability to fight. Russia has a concern about becoming too embroiled in this conflict. I don't think that they see a benefit of becoming an active party in it or being drawn in. But what they're doing is actually trying to empower or at least embolden the Islamic Republic to the best of their ability without being an overt participant. It's getting harder, and I think that this strike actually highlights the real role of Russia in the war and how involved they are. But at the official level and what they say diplomatically is not always commensurate to the support behind the scenes.
Interesting. Alex, your thoughts?
I want to go back to, you just reminded me with that question of something that Javad Zarif said a few years ago. He said, I've had a working relationship with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Ivanov for, I think he said 20-some plus years back then. It's probably longer now. And he said he's come to the conclusion there are two things the Russians don't want to see happen when it comes to the Iran file. They don't want to see the Islamic Republic fall, but nor do they want to see the Islamic Republic being a normal country. So Iran being in trouble all the time, fighting various fights and putting out fires here and there, being in trouble, not becoming normal, not becoming strong, not becoming a challenge. That is bottom line the Russian interest. I'm just giving you a quote of one individual who, whatever it's worth, you can agree or disagree with Zarif, but I think that is a good part of the Islamic Republic when it comes to Russia. The level of trust is not 100%. I mean, I'm being very generous. We don't even have to go back 20 years ago. We look at the Syrian example. Russia is still in Syria. Iran is not. What happened? How come the two friends ended up with different end of the stick when it came to post-Assad Syria? And the Iranian officials raised questions like that. So yes, Russia has an interest when it comes to Iran. Iran can be a vehicle of sorts for the Russians to expand whatever agenda it is that they want to expand. I mean, yesterday was preserving Assad. Tomorrow it might be different. So the Iranians know that. I think they are playing that game more or less as well. So yes, there is a relationship. It's glued together because of anti-Americanism. Essentially, that's what keeps it together. And final point about Nagar, that really raises the issue, depending on where this U.S.-Iran war goes, if the Iranians really do want to patch things up with America, it's huge if down the road. But the relationship with Russia would have to be qualitatively different, I think, in many ways going forward, because they cannot be the Russian spoiler in the Middle East against the Americans. That's not in Iran's interest, and don't think the Americans will put up with it. So that's another way of looking at it, at least down the road.
That's a really excellent point. Thank you so much to you both for the incredibly insightful conversation today on Eye for Iran.
Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you so much.
Well, if you like this episode, you can hit the like button. You can also leave us a comment. Let us know what kind of topics you want to hear for future episodes or potentially even future guests. You can also sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. And please go check out our dedicated English website where we break it all down at iranintl.com/en.